Alright, Shalom. First and foremost, call Halal Yamla, Yahweh, Ba'ashem Yahweh Shai, Ba'ashem HaRachak Wadash. Double honors to the apostles, the bishops, and the elders of Great Millstone that I learned this truth from. And also peace and salutations to the hopeful elect of the nation of Israel, scattered throughout the four corners of the earth. And pretty much in this video, I wanted to go into the whole situation of, NATO and EU being divided up against Babylon the Great America and against the small hats concerning the current conflict between the United States and the state of Israel, all right, waging war with Iran. All right, as you can see, I typed in here on Google, NATO and EU divided over U.S. Israel versus Iran war. All right, and this is the AI response from Google. It says, NATO and European Union members are currently experiencing a significant internal rift over the U.S.-Israeli military campaign against Iran. While some leaders prioritize the transatlantic alliance, others have openly refused to participate in offensive operations, citing concerns over international law and potential regional blowback. Okay, key points of division. It goes into refusal of offensive support. Several European nations, most notably Spain, have refused to allow U.S. forces to use their territory or bases for launch strikes against Iran. Okay, because if you've been watching, keeping up with the whole conflict on out there in Iran, especially over this past week, one of the main NATO countries that's been speaking out against America, okay, showing lack of support for America for waging war against Iran was Spain. Okay, they're refusing to let the United States use their military bases and their air force bases to continue to wage war with Iran. Okay, in Babylon the Great, America under the Trump administration has been showing their disdain for Spain, because of Spain not letting America use their bases to further their offensive attack against Iran. And I even read somewhere as well, well now this current Trump administration is even looking to place particular sanctions on Spain, okay, in response to Spain, not allowing America to use its bases against Iran, okay, its military bases. It says the United Kingdom, all right, Great Britain, also denied the use of its bases at Diego Garcia for offensive strikes, though it remains supportive of defensive measures. All right. And then I'm going to go a little bit further down. It says political fragmentation. Okay, it's pretty much going into some of the major NATO countries that's been pretty much showing some type of opposition against America, okay, or showing some some type of disagreement against America for aiding the state of Israel, the small hats, in war with Iran. It lists Germany, okay, France, Italy, right? And when you go into prophecy, okay, Germany, all right, in prophecy is one of the major NATO countries that would be that's spoken about in these latter days, that would ultimately aid in, okay, these hostile nations such as Russia and China and Iran and so on and so forth, okay, coming up against Babylon the Great America. All right, Germany will be one of the major NATO country, okay, that would ultimately turn cold on America, Babylon the Great, okay, because real quick, all right, when you go to Jeremiah 51. Jeremiah 51 and verse 27, it says, "Set up a standard." All right, speaking about judgment upon Babylon the Great America. All right, Jeremiah 51 verse 27, "Set ye up a standard in the land, blow the trumpet among the nations." Okay, blow the trumpet of war, right? Because in ancient times, especially amongst ancient Israel, okay, there was various occasions where our forefathers will blow trumpets. We will blow trumpets for ceremonial purposes, right? And as well, we would also blow the trumpet, okay, in times of war. Okay, blow a trumpet in time of war for the purpose of, our people are, taking heed to the warning of war and to prepare themselves, right, and brace themselves for war, and as well, blow the trumpet for war for the purpose of gathering, the armies of ancient Israel, okay, to stand in defense against any heathen nation that will try to make war against us, right? So in this case, as it went into Jeremiah 51 and 27, "Set ye up a standard in the land, blow the trumpet among the nations." Okay, blow the trumpet of war, right? "Prepare the nations against her," Babylon the Great. "Call together against her the kingdoms of Ararat," okay, which is Turkey, right? Turkey is another major NATO ally to America that's ultimately going to turn cold as well. Okay, we see right here one example, here in Jeremiah 51 and 27, Ararat, which is Turkey, and also as well, Ezekiel the 38th chapter. Okay, we read about Togarmah. All right, Togarmah is also Turkey. Okay, also represents Turkey in prophecy. Okay, that's said to when you read in Ezekiel 38, it's said to pretty much ally with Gog, which of course Gog in Ezekiel 38 speaks to Russia. Okay, so Turkey is going to be one of the major NATO players, or one of the major NATO allies that's going to turn cold against America, Babylon the Great. All right, and join with its enemies to wage war against America. All right, and especially concerning what's going on out there in Iran. All right, which as of lately, we've already seen Turkey showing, speaking out here and there against, Babylon the Great America, and especially against the small hats over, leading America, Babylon the Great, into war with Iran. The least of the flock shall draw them out, as we always bring out, right? And as well, Turkey, over these past few years, has also been one of the major NATO countries that has been speaking out against the small hats concerning what they're doing over there in Gaza, right? And so it's all going to ultimately lead to, at some point, very, very soon, where Turkey is going to turn cold on America and against the small hats, and ultimately join with Russia along with Iran. Okay, because one thing to know about Turkey, right? Because Turkey is one of the other major NATO players in terms of military power. When you go do your research, but at the same time, Turkey is still a predominantly Muslim country, right? And so, as America and the small hats are going throughout the earth, waging war against the people out there in Gaza, the Palestinians, which are primarily Muslims, right? And as we see currently right now they're waging war against Iran, which is another Muslim country. It's going things like that is going to further lead to countries like Turkey being more and more divided against America and against the small hats, and ultimately joining with America's enemies, namely that of Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, right? And as we see here in Jeremiah 51 and 27, okay, that's prophecy. It says, the middle part of verse 27, "Call together against her the kingdoms of Ararat," which is Turkey, all right, Mini, and Ashkenaz, okay, and Ashkenaz, "Appoint a captain against her," okay, and that captain is talking about Russia. caused the horses to come up as the rough caterpillars. Right, the horses speaking of what? The militaries. Okay, but this word Ashkenaz. Now we know. All right, Ashkenaz was one of the sons of Japheth. All right, but however, okay, when you go into end time prophecy throughout the Bible, Japheth, okay, none of the Japhetic nations, okay, are major players in end time prophecy, okay. But now when you go to Ashkenaz in the scriptures, we know Ashkenaz is one of the sons of Japheth, okay, who after the flood, okay, dwelt in the region that we know today as Germany, right? Germany, which you have a lot of people and even a lot of bugged out Israelites to this very day, okay, believing that those small hats that's over there in the land of Israel today, okay, are Japhets, Japhetic, right? Because what they were brought into that land, out of Germany after World War II, okay, but no, right? And even you have this whole term Ashkenazi Jew and whatnot, okay, but just because you have certain of the small hats calling themselves Ashkenazi Jew and this and the third, that does not mean that they're claiming to be of the seed of Japheth, okay, while at the same time claiming to be Israelites, which are descendants of Shem. Okay, you can't be a descendant of Japheth and a descendant of Shem at the same time. Okay, but when you see these small hats calling themselves, Ashkenazi Jew and so on and so forth, they're not claiming to be of the seed of Japheth. Okay, no, they're just ultimately saying that they come from the region that was formerly ruled over by a Japhetic nation of the Japhetic nation of Ashkenaz. All right, but this term Ashkenaz, and I'm gonna just go straight to the point. When you go to what was that, the Genesius Hebrew Chaldee Lexicon, all right, it goes into name of a region and a nation in North Asia, sprung from the Cimmerians. And then as you read a little bit further down, it says the modern Jews understand it to be Germany. Okay, understand it to be Germany, and call that country by this Hebrew name, which is only to be attributed to their wonderful ignorance of geography. All right, but the main point is, okay, it's showing through the Spirit that Ashkenaz, all right, as we see right here in Jeremiah 51:27, Ashkenaz is listed as one of the countries that will come up against Babylon the Great America in these latter days. All right, and Ashkenaz speaks to who? Germany. Okay, Germany. And what did we just read right here in Google? Okay, political fragmentation. All right, you see who's listed. Germany. Okay, so Germany is one of the major countries, one of the major NATO countries right now that's divided up against America and the small hats over the current war the current war over there in Iran. Okay, and ultimately it's all going to lead to Germany, right? Countries like Germany, along with Turkey, eventually turning cold on America and joining with countries such as Russia, right? To ultimately wage war against America. Okay, and that's all a fulfillment of Bible prophecy. All right. Then as you see, it also lists France, okay, as well as Italy, okay. So hey, it's showing you just three major NATO and EU countries so far that's divided up against America and the small hats over the current war in Iran. All right, but you best believe, as time goes by and as prophecy continues to pass, all right, it's going to be even more NATO and EU countries that's going to be speaking out against Babylon the Great America and against the small hats. Okay, because ultimately, This whole world, including America's NATO and EU allies, they see that this current conflict with Iran is, number one, a war that the small hats have dragged America into. That's number one, first and foremost. The least of the flock shall draw them out, as we always bring out in Jeremiah. But number two, these NATO and EU countries can also see that this current conflict with Iran is not going to end well with America. Okay, America, just going into Iran and bullying Iran to submit to his will, the way that America has done to what the previous nations throughout the so-called Middle East, which is really West Asia. Okay, they see that style of warfare is not going to succeed against Iran in this current day. Okay, but these NATO and EU countries can see and understand that this conflict in this war with Iran, all right, is going to is not going to end well with America, and ultimately is going to backfire. Okay, and as well, they know and understand that if they support America in the small hats with the war with Iran, all right, okay, that's also going to have ramifications against these NATO and EU countries as well, and it's going to backfire upon them as well. You see that? It says NATO stance. Secretary General Mark Rutte officially announced that NATO forces will not join the U.S. in special Iran operations. This has led to public friction with President Trump, who has questioned whether NATO would ever fight alongside Washington if allies refuse to join this specific conflict. Okay, says then it goes into reasons for European hesitation, economic and energy crisis. There are deep fears that a prolonged war will spike energy prices and destabilize the European economy. Okay, and that's already happening slowly but surely here in the States, as over these past couple of weeks we've been seeing the price of gas going up, right, due to the war with Iran, and of course the Strait of Hormuz being being closed down, right? A lot of oil tankers and oil vessels not being able to go to and fro throughout the Strait of Hormuz, right? And a number of them are even getting blown up. Okay, and that's putting a major strain on the global oil supply, right? The global energy market, right? And it's gonna cause what? More oil and gas shortages. Okay, which therefore is leading to what? The gas that's currently available right now, still the price is hiking up. Okay, and it's going to continue to go up more and more as this war continues to linger, right? And as the Strait of Hormuz is going to continue to be closed down, right? And oil tankers getting blown up and bombed and destroyed, right? It's going to destabilize, okay, the global oil supply throughout the earth, right? Along with the supply chain in general, okay, and it's going to cause the price of oil and gasoline to continue to inflate, right? They're even talking about right now how barrel of oil can soon go up to $200 a barrel. You see that? And then it also says retaliation. Iran has explicitly warned that European nations providing logistical or military support to the United States and Israel will be viewed as legitimate military targets. Okay, so these European countries, they also fear being targeted, carnally by Iran as well, right? That's one of the reasons why they're so divided up with this current conflict. And then it also goes into security blowback. European leaders are concerned about a new wave of migration and the potential for Iranian-backed T attacks on European soil. Yeah, so these European countries, they also just understand as well that if this war continues to escalate and get worse and worse, right? The many of those people that are in Iran could possibly migrate and seek refuge to a lot of these European countries. okay, in which, over these years, these European countries have already been dealing with, mass migration from a lot of these, these Arab nations, these Muslim nations. And so, if they were to, receive, a mass number of migration from, Iran, okay, they'll put in even more of a strain on these European countries, when it comes to migration. And as well, it would also spark fear as it went into of, possible Iranian sleeper cell agents, right? Possible T attacks, Black Swan events, right? Then it also goes into resource diversion. There is concern that military equipment and political focus are being diverted away from the war in Ukraine. Okay, but then ultimately as well, we especially us, the hopeful elect, the men of the Lord, we know as well that this war with Iran is also, creating diversion. Is also taking people's attention off of, the previous situation with the Epstein list coming out. Okay, because as we see at this point, in 2026, okay, anything that Esau does at this point is, of course, number one, a fulfillment of Bible prophecy. That's number one. But number two, on the left hand side, Esau Edom, a lot of times uses, certain controversies, certain wars, certain things in the news to distract and take people's minds off of, some previous wickedness or some previous BS that Esau was caught out in the news, okay, before that. You see that? And in this case, this whole conflict and war with Iran, all right, we know that, us, the hopeful elect, the men of the Lord, we know ultimately that number one, this is all fulfillment of Bible prophecy, okay, because, we all knew for the longest that eventually the small hats would drag America, Babylon the Great, into war with Iran, which would then eventually escalate, eventually to World War III, right? But then as well, at the same time, we can also see and understand as well that Esau on the left-hand side is also using this conflict with Iran to, take people's minds off of, the Epstein situation, right? And as well as the technocracy that Esau and his technocrats are building behind closed doors, right? With AI and the MOTB system, okay? But, all in all, okay, this is all, Bible prophecy, first and foremost, okay? And it's all further escalating to the divide and the ultimate destruction of Edomite supremacy, okay? This beast system, America, NATO, and the EU, right? And let's get Daniel, the second chapter. Daniel 2 and verse 40, okay, which this is going into the vision of the statue that was shown to Nebuchadnezzar in a dream, which our forefather Daniel pretty much broke down, okay, the whole entire statue to Nebuchadnezzar, in which, in what each part of the statue represented, right? And in this case, Daniel 2 verse 40, which is going to Rome, right? But then of course we know, according to the scriptures, that after the ancient Western Roman Empire fell around 476 AD, right, eventually Rome would have to be revived, okay, via America, NATO, and EU, which it all started, going back to the Renaissance period up to 1400s, right? But then eventually out of the Renaissance, okay, came what? The eventual emergence of America along with NATO and EU, okay, to officially, restore the power of Rome back into the earth, okay, revive the ancient Greco-Roman system into the earth through America, NATO, and the EU. It says, Daniel 2 verse 40, and the fourth kingdom shall be as strong as iron, for as much as iron breaketh in pieces and subdueth all things. Okay, because of what? Rome had its powerful military back in ancient times, And likewise, America, Babylon the Great, okay, is known for its powerful, dominant military, right, going throughout the four corners of the earth, waging war, okay, coming down with the sword, right, oppressing, overthrowing governments, scoffing at kings, like it speaks of in Habakkuk, okay, removing landmarks and stealing resources, right, all through the sword, okay, through his military. It says, and as iron that breaketh all these, shall it break in pieces and bruise. Verse 41. And whereas thou sawest the feet and toes, part of potter's clay, and part iron, the kingdom shall be divided. See that? The kingdom shall be divided. Okay? And that's speaking to what we see going on, all right, between America versus its NATO and EU allies. Okay? Though they're joined together, in a form of, military alliance, okay, and even making certain deals here and there, financially and economically, okay, but now, as we're seeing, all right, going forward here into 2026, now the Lord is breaking up Esau's kingdom. He's breaking up this revival of Rome, all right, the NATO and EU. You see that? It says, but there shall be in it of the strength of the iron, for as much as thou sawest the iron mixed with miry clay. Verse 42, and as the toes of the feet were divided, Slakia, and as the toes of the feet were part of iron and part of clay, okay, iron and clay cannot mix. It says, so the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly broken, right? And even when you look into these different EU countries, it's composed of stronger European countries, and as well weaker European countries, mainly those Eastern European countries, right? And that speaks and again that speaks perfectly to what we see going on the earth today in the form of NATO and EU. It's partly strong, partly weak, right? Divided, okay? And it says, verse 43, and whereas thou sawest iron mixed with miry clay, they shall mingle themselves with the seed of men. All right, and that speaks to how Esau, going back to the Renaissance of the 1400s up until now, one of the ways that Esau has been able to, go throughout the four corners of the earth and make particular deals with different heathen nations, okay, especially within West Asia, the so-called Middle East, right, is marriages, okay, making marriages with them, mainly with their women, okay, to gain inheritance rights to certain lands and certain resources, right? That's what it speaks to when it says they shall mingle themselves with the seed of men. Okay, it's talking about how Esau has gained access to certain lands and certain resources throughout recent history through making marriages, all right, with certain particular heathen nations, all right, so-called Arab nations, Hamitic nations, and so on and so forth. But it says, but they shall not cleave one to another, even as iron is not mixed with clay. See that? So, just as iron cannot mix with clay, all right, but it remains divided. So likewise, this NATO and EU system, okay, they're together on paper, right? These different countries that make up NATO and EU, they're together in paper, right? But when you get into certain intricate things about them, a lot of them disagree on many things. Okay, a lot of them are divided up when it comes to many things, that especially things that America does throughout the earth. You see that? So a lot of these NATO and EU countries are all divided up, right? And as we see, they're especially divided up concerning this war with Iran. All right. And hey, we know what Yahushua said in the scriptures in the Gospels, kingdom divided. All right, let's get that in Matthew. Matthew 12 and 25. And Yahushua knew their thoughts and said unto them, every kingdom divided against itself is brought to desolation, and every city or house divided against itself shall not stand. See that? In Esau's kingdom, all right, is a kingdom divided. All right, America, NATO, EU, all right, this whole entire beast system is all divided up. Okay, and it's all going to lead to it being desolate. All right, and it's all going to lead to these NATO and EU countries, pretty much turning cold on America and making America desolate, right? And as well the current state of Israel, okay? Because matter of fact, let's go to Revelation 17. All right, Revelation 17, and we'll start at verse 12. Okay, it says, and the 10 horns which thou sawest are 10 kings. Okay, the 10 horns, all right, that you read of in Revelation 17, the 10 horns of the beast that you read of in this chapter is speaking to what? NATO, all right, along with the EU, okay, pretty much America's European allies, okay. The 10 horns of the beast, speaking of America's European allies, NATO and EU, all right, and of course, the whore, all right, that's riding upon the scarlet colored beast being what? Babylon the Great America, okay. Mystery of Babylon, Babylon the Great, all right. Revelation 17 verse 12 again, and the 10 horns which thou sawest are 10 kings, okay, 10 kingdoms, which have received no kingdom as yet, but receive power as kings with 1 hour, 1 hour with the beast, okay. These have one mind and shall give their power and strength unto the beast. See that? So these NATO and EU countries, although none of them are super dominant powers throughout the earth, okay, but they reign with the dominance, or rather behind the dominance of America, Babylon the Great. Okay, they have one mind, meaning what? They agree on a lot of things. Okay, and ultimately, what does America, NATO, and the EU ultimately all agree on? Okay, to forward the revival of ancient Rome. Okay, to restore the ancient Greco-Roman dominance and authority throughout the earth. Okay, but this time on a global scale. When you go into the history of ancient Rome, going back 2,000 years ago, Rome, as dominant as it was, okay, was not able to conquer, the four corners of the earth. Okay, Rome, ultimately, they didn't know about, the western hemisphere of the earth, of course, right? But ultimately, Rome, okay, ancient Western Rome, as dominant and as powerful as it wasn't able to conquer, okay, the four corners of the earth. Nor was it able to conquer all of the other known world, all right, the Eastern world, going back 2,000 years ago. But you see, now in this current day, now, all right, Esau, Edom, via America, NATO, and EU, now, they see this beast system as an opportunity to restore ancient Rome to the earth all over again, okay, to now dominate and conquer literally throughout the four corners of the earth. You see that? They have one mind, okay, and they give their power and strength unto the beast, meaning what? They rule behind the authority and the dominance, okay, and the influence of America, Babylon the Great, okay, these NATO and EU countries. And it says, verse 14, these shall make war with the Lamb, and the Lamb shall overcome them. See that? Because it's all going to lead to, all right, World War III, which World War III is going to usher in the return of Yahushua, okay, which second edges the 13th chapter goes into that, right? And these nations, these heathen nations, when Yahushua returns, they're going to try to literally wage war against Yahushua and the holy angels, okay? And as we see, who's going to be at the forefront of the heathen nations waging war against Yahushua and the angels when Yahushua returns, okay? America, along with their NATO and EU allies, okay? Esau, Edom, basically, right? And it says, verse 14 again, Revelation 17 and 14, these shall make war with the Lamb, and the Lamb shall overcome them. All right, Yahushua is gonna is going to destroy the armies of these heathen nations in a flawless victory. Okay, as it speaks to in Second Ezra 13, he shall lift up neither sword nor weapon of war, right? But ultimately destroy the armies of the heathen with the blast. Okay, those laser beams that's going to be shooting out of the mouth of the chariots, right? And as it says, for he is Lord of lords and King of kings, and they that are with him are called and chosen and faithful, right? And those that are called, chosen, and faithful right here is speaking of the elect, okay? The elect are the ones that have been called in these outer days through the Holy Spirit, right? Through the men of the Lord going out and preaching his word, right? Starting with the apostles, the bishops, and the elders of Great Millstone, right? And even the men that labor before them, going back to Abba Bivens, okay, which Abba Bivens, marked the beginning of the elect, the remnant waking up in his outer days, okay, to call out the elect, right? Call them back to Yahweh Shema Shai, okay? The elect are called and as well chosen, right? And ultimately chosen from the foundation of the heaven and earth, okay? Predestinated, as it speaks of in Ephesians, the 1st chapter, okay? And are faithful, okay? Because in these outer days, it's only us, the hopeful elect, the remnant, that's going to be found faithful to Yahweh Shema Shai by the time Yahweh Shai returns. Lord will not be of their number. Because even as Yahweh Shai spoke about in that parable in Luke the 18th chapter, Yahweh Shai said what? Basically, when the Son of Man returned to the earth, shall he find faith on the earth? Roughly paraphrasing, okay? And the only place that Yahweh Shai is going to find faith on the earth when he returns is amongst the elect, okay? His chosen, all right? The remnant. Lord will not be of the number, okay? But verse 15, Revelation 17, verse 15, and he said unto me, the waters which thou sawest, where the whore sitteth, okay, the whore, mystery Babylon, Babylon the Great, America, okay, are peoples and multitudes and nations and tongues, all right, verse 16, and the 10 horns which thou sawest upon the beast, and again, who are the 10 horns? America's European allies, the NATO and the EU. It says, and the 10 horns which thou sawest upon the beast, these shall hate the whore. See that? These shall hate the whore. So it's coming to a point where these NATO and EU countries, that's been rubbing elbows with America pretty much since since World War II, right? And even before that, right? It's getting ready to come to a point where these European countries are going to now hate America, okay? Because again, these countries are seeing more and more how America's pride and America's stout-heartedness, right, and America's constant thirst and lust for war and violence, especially out there in Iran. They see how all these things are now getting ready to backfire upon them, okay, and even can bring consequences upon them, these NATO and EU countries, right? And that's why even the scripture speaks about it in the Apocrypha, in the book of Sirach, where it talks about travel not with a bold fellow, okay? Because what? These NATO and EU countries, they've been seeing that, traveling with this bold fellow, America, Babylon the Great, all right? For a time, it had its glory, okay? It made America and Europe dominant throughout the earth, right? Military-wise, and if not military-wise, then financial-wise, right? Influence-wise. But now, as of 2026, now these European nations are now seeing that, this bold fellow America is, doing them a disservice with this boldness. Okay. Any little conflict that America is now getting into throughout the earth. Okay. Not only is it having consequences upon America, but now it's even having consequences upon its European allies, NATO and the EU. All right. And you best believe, as we've been going into this conflict between the U.S., Israel, and Iran, is most certainly going to have consequences on not only America, Babylon the Great, of course, but as well these NATO and EU countries. Okay, economic and energy risks, the fear of retaliation, security blowback, okay, resource diversion, right, and so on and so forth. All right, and it's all going to lead to, as we went into the beast, all right, NATO and EU countries hating the whore, Babylon the Great America, all right, by doing what? By joining with, countries by the likes of Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, India, okay, the BRICS nations, okay, to aid in the destruction of Babylon the Great America. It says, and shall make her desolate and naked, and shall eat her flesh and burn her with fire. All right, what type of fire? Nuclear fire, hypersonic missiles, nuclear warheads. Okay, America's own allies, European allies, are going to aid in the destruction of America, Babylon the Great, and the current state of Israel. All right, in World War III, they're going to turn cold upon America. All right, and all this division that we've been going into. All right, in what we've been reading in Google, as well as Daniel the second chapter. All right, all this division is ultimately going to lead to desolation, as Yahushua spoke of in Matthew 12. Okay, the desolation of America, Babylon the Great, the desolation of the current state of Israel. All right, and ultimately the fall of this whole entire beast system, America, NATO, and EU. Okay, and ultimately is all leading to the fall of Edomite supremacy throughout the earth at the end of the day. It's all leading to the fall of Esau's world, as it speaks of in 2 Ezra 6 verse 9. Esau's the end of the world. Okay, and Jacob is the beginning of it that followeth, the kingdom of heaven. All right, so all this division that we see going on within Esau's rulership, his beast system, the NATO, the EU versus America, the small hats, it's all leading to the fall of Edomite supremacy, and it's all ultimately leading to the return of Yahushua Mashiach to establish the kingdom. Okay, Jacob's world, the kingdom of heaven. See that? Jacob's blessing. All right, with Yahushua being at the forefront of Jacob's blessing. Okay, verse 17, Revelation 17, verse 17. For Yahweh Shema Shah hath put in their hearts to fulfill his will, and to agree, and give their kingdom unto the beast, until the words of Yahweh Shema Shah shall be fulfilled. See that? So it's the Lord, okay, throughout all these years and all these decades, that have put the spirit on these NATO and EU countries to to allow America to lead, okay, to fall back behind the authority and the power and the influence of America, okay, to allow America to build up its pride and build up its sins, and let America's sins reach up to the heavens, until the Lord breaks this whole system up and uses America's own allies along with these nations that are hostile against America to ultimately destroy this place by way of thermonuclear destruction. Okay, in World War III. All right, all to fulfill the words of Yahweh Shema Shai. Okay, all to show us, the hopeful elect, the remnant, that the words of Yahweh Shema Shai are most certainly faithful and true. Okay, leading to the return of Yahweh Shai. Okay, to get us the victory over this beast system and his image and his mark. You see that? And matter of fact, I'll get one more. Going into the book of Obadiah. Obadiah verse 7, it says, all the men of thy confederacy. Okay, and of course this chapter Obadiah is speaking against Esau, Edom, right? The Edomites, the so-called white man, okay, who rule over America, Babylon the Great, and the current state of Israel, right? And as well over the NATO and the EU. Okay, this is all Edomite supremacy. It says, Obadiah verse 7, all the men of thy confederacy have brought thee even to the border. The men that were at peace with thee have deceived thee and prevailed against thee. They that eat thy bread have laid a wound under thee. There is none understanding in him. Okay, let's read that in the translations. All right. Matter of fact, I'll read it in the AMP. Obadiah verse 7 in the AMP. It says, all the men allied with you, okay, NATO and EU, shall send you on your way to the border. Meaning they're getting ready to kick you to the curb. Okay, Babylon the Great America. These NATO and EU countries, they're tired of putting up with the wickedness and the BS and the illegal activity done by America, Babylon the Great. Okay, all to satisfy, okay, the will of the small hats. All the men allied with you shall send you on your way to the border. The men who are at peace with you shall deceive you and overpower you, right? By joining with America's enemies, Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, the BRICS nations, right? Salakia. And it says, those who eat your bread, those you trust, right? Because, those that you, sit down and eat with, that you break bread with, right? Are people that you trust, whether it be family members, friends, close ones, right? So those that America trusts, right, that eat America's bread, that break bread with America, right, the NATO and EU countries, it says, shall set a hostile ambush for you. There is no understanding of it. See that? And America, Babylon the Great, through his pride, through his arrogancy, through his stout-heartedness, right, has no understanding, okay, that, the whole world is isolating America, even its own allies, and the whole world is, pretty much gearing up to wage war against America, along with the small heads. You see that? And what, Esau, Edom, here in America, Babylon the Great, okay, still to this day doesn't understand is that, looking at this current war with Iran, all right, it's all going to end up for the worst of America. It's all getting ready to backfire. Okay, it's all getting ready to backfire upon Babylon the Great America. It's all going to backfire upon the small hats, because it's all eventually going to escalate to World War III. Okay, well, Russia and China is going to get involved. All right, and the NATO and EU countries are going to be siding with Russia and China to ultimately shoot nukes upon America. Okay, and as well the small hats, the current state of Israel, and lead to its desolation. You see that? All to fulfill the will and the word of Yahweh Shema Shai at the end of the day. Okay, and lead to the elect getting the victory over this beast system and his image and his mark through being covered by the blood of Hamashiach Yahweh Shai. See that? So yeah, So hey, Edomite supremacy is all divided up in these outer days. It's being broken down. It's being, the NATO and the EU is all, breaking themselves apart more and more, little by little, against America and against the small hats. And when it's all said and done, it's all further escalating to the end of Esau's world and the downfall of Edomite supremacy. And it's all as well going to lead to Jacob's world being established. Okay, the return of Yahweh Shai to establish the kingdom of heaven, right? And for Jacob and the Israelites to enter into our blessing. You see that? Immortality, right? Ruling over the heathen in the kingdom of heaven forever and ever and ever under Yahweh Shai. You see that? So so with that, Lord willing, this video is edifying. And until next time, Shalom.